Cold dawn met Judge Hayes outside the courthouse, her robe concealed ready to preside over Brennan and Ridgway's hearing, but the officers saw only a perceived threat, forcefully detaining her, ignoring her calm words, unaware they assaulted their own judge. This explosive irony sets the stage. What occurs when bias-blind sworn officers tell us where you are tuning in from? Show support for truth, hit like, subscribe, because tomorrow the clerk's frantic revelation ignites chaos you cannot miss. Pressed hard against the unforgiving mortar and brick of the courthouse wall, Judge Evelyn Hayes felt the rough texture scrape through her coat, a grounding insult amidst the bewildering assault. Officer Brennan's fingers dug into the flesh of her arm with bruising force, while Officer Ridgway positioned himself as a solid barrier, cutting off any possibility of movement. His stance was proprietary, aggressive, the stance of a man used to unquestioned dominance in such encounters. A wave of dizziness washed over Hayes momentarily, the sheer unexpectedness of the violence stealing her breath. She tasted copper in her mouth, perhaps from biting her lip. She consciously reined in the surge of outrage that threatened to overwhelm her. Drawing upon years of practiced judicial control, her voice, though tight, emerged with forced steadiness. "Officers, identify yourselves and state the reason for this physical detention. I am Judge Evelyn Hayes, assigned to this courthouse. You are interfering with my official duties." Brennan let out a short, derisive snort. Disbelief and contempt mingled in his eyes. "Judge Hayes, is that the best you can come up with, lady? We know who the judges are. You ain't one of them." Ridgway added, his tone heavy with insinuation. "Trying to intimidate officers, huh? Flashing a fake title won't work. We see your kind all the time trying to cause trouble, especially on days like this when good cops are getting railroaded." Their immediate dismissal, their refusal to even consider her statement, the easy slide into accusation, based on nothing but her appearance and the context of the day. It was a performance of prejudice honed through practice. They saw not a person, let alone a figure of authority, but a preconceived threat, a stereotype, fitting their narrative of disruptive outsiders. She tried again, modulating her voice, striving for maximum clarity and authority. "I assure you, I am Judge Hayes. My chambers are 3 floors above us. My clerk, Maria Flores, is expecting. Miss, if you will simply escort me to the security desk inside, they can verify my identity. Instigating physical contact without cause constitutes assault." Brennan responded by applying more pressure to her arm. A deliberate infliction of pain meant to silence and subdue. "You gonna come quietly, or do we need to make this official?" He threatened, his breath hot and unpleasant near her face. "Maybe a night in lockup will improve your attitude." He seemed to relish the confrontation, the power imbalance. He reached towards his belt, perhaps for handcuffs, ready to escalate further. Just then a sharp gasp pierced the tense standoff. Maria Flores, Judge Hayes's ever-punctual clerk, had turned the corner expecting to meet her judge for their usual docket review instead. She froze mid-step, her briefcase slipping from suddenly numb fingers, her face paling dramatically as she registered the scene. Judge Hayes, her esteemed mentor, the powerful jurist known for her sharp intellect and unwavering fairness, pinned against the wall like a common criminal. By 2 uniformed officers, Maria recognized the officers instantly, Brennan and Ridgway, the subjects of the very misconduct hearing scheduled in Judge Hayes's courtroom later that morning. The pieces clicked together in a horrifying tableau. Mistaken identity, fueled by blatant profiling, escalating into physical assault against the very judge holding their fate in her hands. Maria's paralysis broke, replaced by a surge of protective fury and sheer panic. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice echoing unnaturally loud in the still morning air. "Let her go right now. Are you blind? Are you insane? That is Judge Hayes, Judge Evelyn Hayes. She is presiding over your misconduct hearing today. Do you understand, your judge?" The words tumbled out, frantic, impassioned, amplified by terror and disbelief. She pointed directly at the officers, her hand trembling violently. The effect on Brennan and Ridgway was instantaneous. It was as if an electric current had shot through them. Brennan snatched his hand away from Hayes's arm, leaving fiery imprints. He stumbled back a step, his face transforming from aggressive certainty to gaping disbelief, then to sheer white-knuckled panic. Ridgway physically recoiled, his eyes wide with horror, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish out of water. The color drained from both their faces, leaving them looking suddenly small, deflated, stripped bare of their aggressive posture. All the swagger, all the contemptuous authority vanished, replaced by the raw terror of men who realize they have just committed a potentially career-ending, possibly criminal act against one of the most powerful figures in the building. Their world had tilted on its axis, the hunter suddenly realizing they had attacked the apex predator. The stunned silence that followed Maria's outburst felt heavier than the preceding confrontation, broken only by the distant rumble of city traffic and the frantic pounding. So of three hearts, Brennan's Ridgway's and Maria's Judge Hayes slowly straightened, pushing herself away from the wall. Her expression remained controlled, but her eyes held a chilling stillness as she observed the utter disintegration of her assailant's composure. The sudden brutal power shift hung in the air, undeniable, irrevocable. The explosive revelation hung in the air, shattering the early morning stillness. Officers Brennan and Ridgway snapped from their aggressive posture into a state of pure, unadulterated panic, their faces drained of color, their eyes wide with the horrifying understanding of what they had done. They lurched towards Judge Evelyn Hayes, hands fluttering nervously, fingers twitching, desperate apologies tumbling out in a disjointed stammer. "Judge, oh my God, Judge Hayes, we didn't know. It was a mistake, an honest mistake." Brennan sputtered, his voice several octaves higher than before. "We thought you were... We had an alert about protesters, trying to secure the perimeter." Ridgway nodded vigorously, adding, "We were just following procedure. Judge, security protocols for unidentified individuals approaching the entrance before ours. Please, you have to understand. We meant no disrespect." Judge Hayes instinctively took a step back, creating space away from their frantic energy and insincere apologies. She remained silent, her expression unreadable, Bing-leng, icy cold in this context, but her eyes missed nothing. She catalogued their terror, their shifting gazes, their clumsy attempts to deflect responsibility onto procedures or vague threats. It was a pathetic performance fueled by self-preservation, not remorse. Watching Hayes stay so calm while those officers panicked was something, wasn't it? Comment number 1. If you admire her composure under that extreme pressure. Just then, Captain Davis, the courthouse security supervisor, arrived on the scene, alerted perhaps by Maria Flores's shouts or a discreet radio call. He was a sturdy man with weary eyes who had seen almost everything but the sight before him clearly. Startled him, Judge Hayes, looking disheveled but composed, standing opposite two of his officers who looked like they were about to collapse. Judge Hayes. "Are you all right?" Captain Davis asked, his voice conveying professional concern layered with deep apprehension. "What happened here?" Before Hayes could respond, Brennan and Ridgway both started talking at once, tripping over each other's words, offering conflicting fragments of their fabricated narrative. Mistaken identity, captain, just a misunderstanding. Heightened security alert. Thought she was trying to breach the entrance following protocol. Hayes cut through their panicked excuses, her voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "Captain Davis," she addressed the supervisor, directly ignoring the two. "Officers for the moment. These officers, Brennan and Ridgway, forcibly detained me against that wall without identifying themselves properly or stating any legitimate cause. When I identified myself as a judge of this court, they refused to believe. Me and Officer Brennan applied painful physical force. Their conduct constituted assault and unlawful detention." Captain Davis visibly paled further. He shot a furious glare at Brennan and Ridgway, who wilted under his gaze. He turned back to Hayes. "Profusely apologetic, Judge. I'm incredibly sorry this happened. There is no excuse. We will investigate this fully immediately. Please let me escort you inside. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Brennan seized the opportunity. "Please, Judge. It was a terrible mistake. We feel awful. We apologize profusely." Hayes finally turned her gaze fully onto the two officers. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "I have heard your explanations," she stated evenly. "Your apologies at this moment are irrelevant. This incident requires formal documentation and investigation through the appropriate channels." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, then delivered the blow that sealed their immediate dread. And now, gentlemen, if you'll excuse me, I have a docket to attend to this morning, including, as my clerk correctly stated, disciplinary hearing number 87-2 concerning alleged misconduct by both of you. We will proceed as scheduled at 9 a.m. This separate matter, she gestured, almost imperceptibly towards the wall where she'd been pinned, will be addressed after my judicial duties for the day are concluded. Hayes deciding to still preside over their original hearing after they assaulted her. Wow, talk about icy resolve. If you think that takes incredible strength, hit that like button. The finality in her tone, the calm assertion that she would still preside over their hearing after what they had just done, drained the last vestiges of color from Brennan's and Ridgway's faces. They stared at her speechless, trapped between the immediate horror of assaulting a judge and the impending horror of facing that same judge in a disciplinary hearing that could end their careers. Without another word, Judge Hayes turned crisply, smoothing her coat. She gave a slight nod to Maria Flores, who hastily gathered her scattered papers, her hands still trembling slightly. Together, judge and clerk walked with measured steps towards the courthouse entrance, leaving Brennan, Ridgway, and a deeply troubled Captain Davis, standing frozen on the sidewalk, engulfed in the disastrous consequences of unchecked bias and impulsive action, walking away like that, leaving them terrified. She totally owned that moment, didn't she? If you cannot wait to see what happens when she actually gets them in her courtroom, make sure you subscribe. The tension is only going to build. Judge Hayes had masterfully regained control of the immediate situation, turning their panic against Thembois. But as she walked through the courthouse doors, the weight of the impossible ethical dilemma settled upon her. How could she possibly preside fairly over the disciplinary hearing for the very officers who had physically assaulted her only moments before? And more urgently, how would those officers, now facing professional ruin and potential criminal charges, and the powerful union undoubtedly already mobilizing to protect them, react to the fact that their fate still rested, however, temporarily in the hands of the judge they had just attacked? The heavy oak door of Judge Evelyn Hayes's chambers clicked shut, providing a fragile barrier against the chaos brewing outside. Maria Flores immediately fussed over the judge, her hands trembling as she retrieved a small first aid kit from her desk. Judge, are you sure you are all right? Your cheek is scraped, your wrist looks bruised, let me help. Hayes waved her off gently, though she appreciated the concern. I'm all right, Maria. Just shaken, more angry than hurt. She sank into her high-backed leather chair, the familiar comfort, doing little to soothe the turmoil within. The adrenaline from the confrontation was receding, leaving behind a sickening mix of violation fury and a profound sense of irony. She touched her cheek, wincing slightly. The physical sting was negligible compared to the psychic wound inflicted by the casual dehumanization, the assumption of criminality based solely on her race and presence. The fact that the assailants were the very officers whose professional conduct she was scheduled to evaluate made the situation grotesque absurd. She had spent years meticulously building a reputation for fairness, impartiality, and rigorous adherence to the law. Now that reputation felt instantly vulnerable, tainted, by the very people she was tasked with judging. How could she possibly preside over their hearing now? Every ruling, every question, every facial expression would be scrutinized, interpreted through the lens of this morning's assault. A finding against them would inevitably be labeled as revenge. A finding in their favor might be seen as weakness, capitulation, or even tacit approval of their behavior. The ethical tightrope felt impossibly narrow, threatening to snap under the weight of this conflict. Maria, watching her judge's distress, voiced the thought aloud. Judge Hayes, you can't possibly hear their case now, can you? It wouldn't be right. Not after what they did. Hayes sighed, rubbing her temples. You are right, Maria. Of course I can't. The appearance of impropriety alone is disqualifying, let alone the actual personal experience. But the alternative is also problematic. Recusing myself now, especially if they request it, could be misinterpreted. It could look like they succeeded. In intimidating a judge off their case, it sets a dangerous precedent. She knew she needed to act swiftly and correctly. She needed to consult Chief Judge Roberts, the presiding judge of the Superior Court. She picked up her secure internal line requesting an immediate private meeting, citing an urgent matter involving courthouse security and judicial ethics. While she waited for Roberts to respond, the courthouse itself was already buzzing. The incident, though brief, had been witnessed by Maria and, possibly other early arriving staff. The initial shock was rapidly morphing into rampant speculation. Whispers echoed in hallways, hushed conversations paused abruptly when uninvolved parties approached. "Did you hear about Hayes' cops roughed her up outside? Apparently she lost it on them. No way they jumped her mistaken identity. I heard it was those two guys, Brennan and Ridgway, the ones with the hearing today." Unbelievable. The rumor mill distorted, exaggerated, painting conflicting pictures. Fueled by incomplete information and existing biases, Chief Judge Roberts, a stern, experienced jurist, known for his cautious temperament, agreed to meet Hayes immediately in his chambers. Hayes recounted the events concisely, factually omitting overt, emotional displays but clearly conveying the gravity of the assault and the resulting ethical quandary. Roberts listened intently, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "This is deeply troubling, Evelyn," he said finally. "A clear conflict has been created. You absolutely cannot preside over their hearing now. We will need to reassign it immediately." But the situation took another shocking turn. Even as they discussed reassignment procedures, Roberts's intercom buzzed. His secretary's voice sounded urgent. "Chief Judge, apologies for the interruption, but Sergeant O'Malley from the police union and their attorney, Mr. Thorne, are here demanding to file an emergency motion regarding Judge Hayes and the Brennan-Ridgway hearing. They claim immediate action is required." Roberts and Hayes exchanged a look of disbelief. O'Malley, the aggressive police union president, and Arthur Thorne, the notorious defense attorney known for representing cops. They had moved with astonishing speed. Roberts instructed his secretary to accept the filing. A few minutes later, a clerk delivered the document. Roberts read it, his eyebrows climbing higher with each paragraph. He then passed it to Hayes, his expression grim. "They beat us to it, Evelyn. They've filed a motion for your recusal." Hayes scanned the document, her initial disbelief hardening into cold fury. The motion, crafted by Thorne and undoubtedly driven by O'Malley, was a masterpiece of audacious distortion. It alleged that during a routine security inquiry outside the courthouse, Judge Hayes had become verbally abusive, belligerent, and physically non-compliant. It claimed she had made explicit threats regarding the officer's upcoming hearing, demonstrating profound personal animus and bias. It argued her actions necessitated her immediate recusal to ensure a fair hearing for Officers Brennan and Ridgway. They had twisted the entire incident, turning the victim into the aggressor, fabricating a narrative where her reaction to being assaulted was somehow grounds for her disqualification. It was a brazen, preemptive strike, designed not only to force her off their case, but to simultaneously discredit her, preemptively neutralize any complaint she might file against them, and seize control of the narrative. The ethical nightmare had instantly become a public relations battlefield, and her attackers had just launched a vicious surprise counteroffensive aimed directly at her judicial integrity. The union's preemptive recusal motion landed like a tactical bomb, shattering the already fragile atmosphere within the courthouse. Sergeant O'Malley and defense attorney Arthur Thorne moved with calculated speed, ensuring their fabricated narrative. Painting Judge Evelyn Hayes as the aggressor saturated internal courthouse communications and sympathetic media channels before she could even fully process the morning's assault or consult thoroughly on the ethical implications. The pressure on Hayes became immediate and intense. O'Malley, fueled by outrage and a strategic desire to control the disciplinary hearing's outcome, worked the phones relentlessly, contacting influential city officials, other judges, anyone who might exert pressure. He painted Hayes as emotionally compromised, biased, unable to separate her alleged personal altercation from her judicial duties. Thorne, meanwhile, prepared scathing legal arguments, citing obscure precedents and exaggerating the claims of Hayes's supposed belligerence. The courthouse itself became a pressure cooker. Fellow judges approached Hayes with expressions of carefully worded concern. Chief Judge Roberts, while privately appalled by the assault on a colleague, felt the immense weight of maintaining public confidence in the judiciary. Evelyn, he urged gently in a second private meeting. Perhaps stepping aside from this specific hearing is the wisest course, not because their motion has merit, heaven forbid, but simply to avoid any perception of bias, however unfounded. It protects you and it protects the institution. Think of the appeals, the endless challenges if you rule against them now. Others were less diplomatic, subtly hinting that her refusal to recuse could be seen as stubbornness or even arrogance, further damaging the court's reputation. It's tough when even colleagues pressure you to back down for optics instead of principle, isn't it? Comment number 1, if you think Hayes should stand her ground. Despite the pressure from other judges, Hayes felt besieged. She retreated to the quiet solitude of her chambers, asking Maria Flores to hold all calls. She spent hours poring over the Judicial Code of Conduct, recusal statutes, relevant case law. She consulted remotely with a trusted senior judge from another district, known for her expertise in judicial ethics. The ethical analysis was complex. On one hand, the personal experience of being assaulted by litigants undeniably created a potential conflict. On the other, the conflict was created entirely by the misconduct of the officers themselves. Allowing litigants to force a judge's recusal through assault or intimidation set a disastrous precedent. It would effectively grant parties veto, power over the judges assigned to their cases. Recusing herself would feel like validating Brennan and Ridgway's lies, rewarding their violence and O'Malley's cynical maneuvering. It would signal weakness and embolden future attacks on the judiciary. She recognized the motion for what it was, a cynical trap. If she recused, O'Malley won. If she refused, they would relentlessly attack her impartiality, appealing any adverse ruling. After hours of intense deliberation, wrestling with legal, precedent, ethical obligations, and her own sense of justice, Hayes made her decision. She would not be bullied off the case by the very individuals whose misconduct was under review. She began drafting her ruling meticulously, choosing each word with judicial precision. Her written order, when filed later that day, was a masterclass in controlled legal reasoning. First, she formally acknowledged that an incident involving herself and officers Brennan and Ridgway had occurred earlier that morning. Outside the courthouse. Second, she stated that the facts and circumstances surrounding that separate incident would be referred immediately to the appropriate independent investigatory and prosecutorial authorities. Third, she addressed the recusal motion directly. She cited case law establishing that generally a party cannot force a judge's disqualification based on conduct initiated by that party towards the judge. Fourth, she affirmed her sworn duty to preside over matters assigned to her, unless legally disqualified. Finally, and most importantly, she found that while the morning's incident was deeply disturbing, it did not impair her ability to impartially assess the distinct evidence already contained within the official record. Pertaining to the original allegations of misconduct in case number 87-2, which predated the assault. Therefore, the defense motion for recusal from presiding over the pre-existing disciplinary hearing was respectfully but firmly denied. While Judge Hayes refusing to recuse takes guts, knowing the attacks she'll face. If you admire her courage and commitment to principle, hit that like button. The ruling landed with the force of a counterstrike. O'Malley and Thorne were reportedly furious. O'Malley immediately issued an enraged statement to the press, condemning Judge Hayes's decision as arrogant, unprecedented, and clear evidence of her vindictive bias. He promised to appeal to explore all options to have her removed, vowing that officers Brennan and Ridgway could not possibly receive a fair hearing. Before a judge who was actively pursuing action against them for a separate incident, the battle lines were now starkly drawn. The attempt to force Hayes off the case through manipulation and false accusations had failed, but it had also guaranteed that the upcoming disciplinary hearing would be conducted under an atmosphere of extreme hostility, intense scrutiny, and the certainty of further attacks from a powerful union now engaged in total war. O'Malley is furious. Hayes didn't back down. This means the misconduct hearing itself is going to be incredibly tense. If you want to see how Judge Hayes handles presiding over the hearing for the officers who assaulted her, make sure you subscribe. You don't want to miss this. Judge Hayes had refused to yield, asserting her authority and defending the principle against manipulation. But now she faced the extraordinary, daunting challenge of actually presiding impartially over a disciplinary hearing for the very men who had physically attacked her just hours earlier. How would she maintain judicial composure, navigate the inevitable provocations, and ensure fairness under the hostile glare of the officers, their lawyer, and the powerful union determined to undermine her every ruling and ultimately her entire career? The air in Judge Evelyn Hayes's courtroom crackled with an almost unbearable tension as Court Officer Stevens formally called disciplinary hearing number 87-2, City versus Officer Kyle Brennan and Officer Mark Ridgway. This was the original misconduct hearing. The reason Judge Hayes had arrived early, the case that had inadvertently set the stage for her own assault hours, before every eye was fixed on the bench where Judge Hayes sat, composed her face, an impassive mask of judicial neutrality. Below her at the respondent table sat Brennan and Ridgway, looking pale and tense, flanked by their aggressive defense attorney Arthur Thorne. Across from them sat the assistant city attorney, tasked with presenting the case against the officers. In the front row of the gallery, Sergeant O'Malley, the police union president, watched intently, his arms crossed, his expression thunderous. Judge Hayes surveyed the room briefly, then addressed the parties, her voice clear, steady, devoid of any tremor. Her opening statement was concise, establishing the narrow focus of the proceeding. This hearing concerns exclusively the allegations detailed in the formal complaint number 87-2 regarding an incident occurring on October 17th of last year involving officers Brennan and Ridgway and civilian complainant Mr. James Peterson. Evidence and arguments will be strictly confined to the facts and circumstances relevant to that specific complaint. Any attempts to introduce unrelated matters will be disallowed. We will proceed according to the established rules of evidence and procedure. The city attorney began presenting the case against Brennan and Ridgway, detailing the original incident. Mr. Peterson, an older black man, had been stopped for an alleged minor traffic infraction. The situation reportedly escalated, resulting in Mr. Peterson sustaining injuries requiring medical attention. The city attorney presented photographs of Mr. Peterson's injuries, medical records documenting treatment for bruised ribs and lacerations, and a partial bystander cell phone video. The video, though shaky and incomplete, appeared to show Officer Brennan using forceful tactics seemingly disproportionate to the situation while Officer Ridgway stood by. The attorney also introduced Brennan and Ridgway's initial incident report, which described Mr. Peterson as belligerent and resistant claims the attorney argued were contradicted by the video. Evidence throughout this presentation, Judge Hayes maintained an unwavering focus. She listened intently, made notes, ruled on procedural points with crisp efficiency. When Thorne objected to the admission of the bystander video arguing foundation and chain of custody, Hayes carefully considered the arguments before overruling him, finding sufficient basis for its admission. When the city attorney sought to introduce testimony about other unrelated complaints against Brennan deemed inadmissible, in pre-hearing rulings, Hayes swiftly sustained Thorne's objection, citing her previous order. Her rulings were legally precise, demonstrating no bias, only adherence to the law. Arthur Thorne, however, seemed determined to test the limits of Hayes's composure and the boundaries of relevance. During his cross-examination of the city's first witness, an internal affairs investigator who authenticated the reports, Thorne began subtly probing. "Counselor, you indicated the officers reported Mr. Peterson was agitated. Isn't it common for individuals stopped by police, even for minor reasons, to become agitated, perhaps leading to misunderstandings about their compliance?" The city attorney objected. "Relevance. Your Honor," sustained Judge Hayes stated flatly, "confine your questions to Mr. Peterson's documented actions." Counselor. Later, while questioning the same investigator, Thorne tried again. "Investigator, based on your experience, don't officers sometimes face situations where a person's official position might lead them to believe they are above routine questioning, causing friction?" Objection sustained. Judge Hayes interjected sharper this time. Counsel approached the bench. At the sidebar, Hayes addressed Thorne in a low but intense voice. "Mr. Thorne, I understand your strategy. Your attempts to subtly allude to the unrelated incident this morning are transparent, unprofessional, and bordering on contemptuous. Confine yourself strictly to the evidence pertaining to the October 17th incident involving Mr. Peterson, or I will impose sanctions. Do you understand?" Thorne flushed slightly but nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Despite the warning, Thorne continued to push the envelope during his presentation of the defense case. He called fellow officers to testify about Brennan and Ridgway's generally good character, framing the Peterson incident as an unfortunate but justifiable reaction to a stressful situation. During his questioning of one character witness, Thorne asked, "Isn't it true, officer, that sometimes individuals perceived as challenging authority, perhaps due to their own sense of status, can create volatile situations requiring officers to react decisively?" "Objection sustained, Mr. Thorne. This court has warned you." Judge Hayes's voice was ice. Her control was absolute, but the effort it took was visible in the slight tightening around her eyes. She refused to be baited, refused to show any personal reaction, refused to give Thorne or O'Malley the satisfaction of seeing her composure crack. Each attempt by Thorne to inject prejudice or reference the morning's assault was met with a swift, legally sound ruling shutting him down. Her performance was a masterclass in judicial temperament under extreme duress. She was demonstrating her ability to compartmentalize, to rule solely on the law and facts. Before her regarding the original misconduct, even while the separate matter of her own assault by the same men loomed large, but the constant provocations, the need for unwavering vigilance, the knowledge that every ruling was being scrutinized for bias, created an atmosphere of intense psychological pressure. The hearing progressed slowly, painstakingly, through the evidence pertaining only to the James Peterson incident. Judge Hayes successfully navigated the procedural minefield, maintaining control of her courtroom and upholding the appearance and reality of impartiality for now. But the tension was a coiled spring, waiting for the slightest misstep to snap. While Judge Evelyn Hayes meticulously maintained judicial impartiality within the confines of the courtroom, presiding over the original Brennan-Ridgway disciplinary hearing, a separate storm was gathering momentum outside those walls. The blatant assault on a sitting judge could not be ignored even by a system often inclined to protect its own. Recognizing the inherent conflict of interest in having the local police department investigate two of its own for assaulting a judge, the state Attorney General appointed a special counsel, Miriam Shah, a respected former federal prosecutor known for her independence and tenacity, to lead the investigation into the incident outside the courthouse. This parallel probe began immediately moving, with a deliberate urgency, distinct from the slow crawl of the internal disciplinary hearing. Special Counsel Shah's first order of business was obtaining formal sworn statements. Judge Hayes provided hers, recounting the events of that morning. With precision and clarity, she detailed her arrival, her calm responses, Brennan and Ridgway's immediate unwarranted hostility, their dismissal of her identification, the physical force used, the racist and demeaning language employed. Her statement carried the weight of her office, but also the raw truth of a citizen unjustly attacked. Maria Flores provided her corroborating testimony, equally crucial. She described witnessing the physical confrontation, hearing Judge Hayes clearly identify, herself seeing the officers ignore her pleas, and finally her own desperate intervention, revealing the judge's identity and connection to their hearing. Her account was emotional, yet unwavering, providing vital eyewitness confirmation. Investigators, under Shah's direction, fanned out seeking additional evidence. They interviewed other courthouse staff, security personnel, maintenance workers, anyone who might have been present that early morning, uncovering little. Most arrived later or saw nothing definitive. They meticulously collected and reviewed security footage from multiple cameras covering the courthouse exterior, including the side entrance where the assault occurred. They subpoenaed dispatch logs and radio traffic from the time of the incident simultaneously. Officers Brennan and Ridgway provided their own official statements to Special Counsel Shah's investigators. It was clear they had been extensively coached, likely by Arthur Thorne and Sergeant O'Malley. Their accounts were nearly identical, polished narratives, emphasizing mistaken identity, adherence to protocol, and portraying Judge Hayes as the source of the escalation. They claimed they approached Hayes due to heightened security concerns regarding potential protests, believing she matched a vague description of individuals attempting unauthorized access. They alleged she refused to identify herself, became argumentative, and made sudden movements that they interpreted as potentially threatening, necessitating standard restraint techniques to ensure officer safety. They vehemently denied using excessive force or any inappropriate language, insisting it was a regrettable misunderstanding handled according to procedure. It's infuriating how they twisted the story to blame Judge Hayes, isn't it? Comment number 1 if you think their official story sounds like a complete fabrication. The critical piece of evidence everyone awaited was the analysis of the primary security camera footage covering the exact location of the confrontation. Special counsel Shah and her lead investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame in a secure viewing room. The video quality was decent for surveillance capturing the sequence of events. The footage clearly showed Judge Hayes walking calmly towards the entrance, Brennan and Ridgway accosting her, an apparent verbal exchange followed by Brennan grabbing Hayes's arm and shoving her against the wall. Ridgway moving to assist, it visually documented. The forceful physical detention, contradicting the officer's claims that Hayes was aggressive or that they used minimal restraint. Maria Flores could be seen rushing into frame moments later, her frantic gestures confirming her intervention. However, the footage had significant limitations. The camera angle partially obscured the officers' faces, and Hayes's expression during the most intense moments, making it difficult to definitively assess intent or read lips. Critically, the camera lacked audio recording capabilities. There was no digital record of Hayes identifying herself or the officer's alleged racist remarks. This absence of clear audio created a frustrating ambiguity. The video proved an assault occurred, contradicting the officer's denials about the level of force, but it couldn't definitively prove the officers knew she was a judge when they assaulted her, nor could it capture their verbal bias. The video backed up Judge Hayes, but it's not perfect. That means the fight is far from over. If you want to see how O'Malley and Thorne try to spin this ambiguous evidence, make sure you subscribe. The manipulation attempts are just getting started. Special Counsel Shah recognized the video was powerful, yet flawed. It corroborated Judge Hayes's core claim of being physically assaulted without provocation, but the lack of audio and perfect visual clarity provided Thorne and O'Malley with openings to argue interpretation, to muddy the waters, to claim the officers reacted reasonably to perceived non-compliance, even if mistaken about identity. It meant the case might ultimately hinge on credibility. Hayes's word and Maria's against two police officers backed by a powerful union skilled at discrediting accusers. So the video backs up Judge Hayes, but it's not perfect. That means the fight is far from over. If you want to see how O'Malley and Thorne try to spin this ambiguous evidence, make sure you subscribe. The manipulation attempts are just getting started, with the security footage confirming the assault, but leaving crucial elements open to dispute how would Sergeant O'Malley and the increasingly desperate police union retaliate, now that visual proof contradicted at least part of their officers' false narrative. Or facing tangible evidence, would they shift tactics, perhaps launching even more vicious personal and dangerous attacks against Judge Hayes herself, aiming to discredit her entirely before Special Counsel Shah's investigation could conclude? The ambiguous nature of the security footage, while visually damning regarding the physical detention, offered Sergeant O'Malley and Arthur Thorne just enough wiggle room to continue their offensive. They knew a purely factual defense of Brennan, and Ridgway's actions during the assault on Judge Hayes was weak, so they doubled down on attacking the judge herself, seeking to discredit her so profoundly that any testimony she provided would be deemed unreliable, and any investigation she triggered viewed as suspect. O'Malley, operating with the union's considerable resources and Thorne's legal cunning, launched a multi-pronged assault designed to isolate, intimidate, and ultimately break Judge Hayes. First came the targeted leaks, designed to erode her professional standing. Snippets from confidential documents, decades-old performance reviews, comments taken wildly out of context from judicial evaluations, even carefully selected excerpts from her rulings chosen specifically to portray her as biased against law enforcement, began appearing on inflammatory blogs and were echoed by sympathetic right-wing commentators. Anonymous courthouse sources, clearly fed by O'Malley's network, whispered to reporters about Judge Hayes' supposed volatile temperament, her alleged inability to handle pressure, her supposed history of clashing with police liaisons. Each leak, each planted story, was a pinprick designed to bleed her credibility drop by drop. Simultaneously, O'Malley worked political channels. He met privately with state legislators, known for their tough-on-crime stances and deference to police unions. He painted Judge Hayes as a rogue activist judge, using her position to advance a personal anti-police agenda. He urged them to consider legislative oversight hearings into judicial conduct, hinting darkly about potential impeachment proceedings if she continued her perceived crusade. The goal was to create political pressure from above, forcing her superiors, or appointing authorities to intervene and sideline her. The atmosphere within the courthouse itself grew increasingly poisonous. Judge Hayes felt the chill acutely. While many colleagues offered private words of support, few dared to do so publicly. Fearing union retribution, uniformed officers in the hallways pointedly ignored her or offered barely concealed glares. Security checks at the judge's entrance previously. Routine became deliberately slow and officious only when she passed through. Courtroom staff loyal to the union sometimes seemed slow to respond to her requests, creating minor but persistent friction. It was a campaign of 1,000 paper cuts designed to wear her down, to make her daily life untenable. Maria Flores, fiercely loyal, tried to shield her judge from the worst of it, but the pervasive hostility was undeniable. Yet the most sinister escalation occurred not within the courthouse walls, but targeted the very disciplinary hearing. Judge Hayes was still, painstakingly attempting to conduct impartially. The key witness in that original case, Case 87-2, was Mr. James Peterson, the elderly man whose testimony regarding Brennan and Ridgway's alleged excessive force 6 months prior formed the crux of the complaint against them. Mr. Peterson, already reluctant to testify against police officers, had been persuaded by the city attorney handling the disciplinary case that his voice was necessary for accountability. As the hearing dates approached, the city attorney received a panicked phone call from Mr. Peterson. His voice shaking, he reported a series of escalating intimidations, anonymous calls, breathing heavily, then hanging up. His car tires slashed overnight outside his apartment building. Most recently, he described seeing unfamiliar men parked on his street watching his movements. He was terrified. He stated unequivocally that he could no longer testify, fearing for his safety and potentially that of his family. The city attorney immediately informed Judge Hayes and Chief Judge Roberts. The implication was horrifying. While direct proof was again elusive, the timing and nature of the intimidation pointed directly at O'Malley's network. It was a clear message: if Judge Hayes wouldn't back down, they would dismantle the case against Brennan and Ridgway piece by piece, starting with silencing the primary witness. This wasn't just about protecting Brennan and Ridgway from the consequences of assaulting a judge anymore. It was about ensuring they escaped accountability for their original alleged misconduct as well. It demonstrated a ruthless willingness to engage in witness tampering, a serious felony, to achieve their aims. The news struck Judge Hayes with force. Realizing that her own pursuit of justice and her refusal to be intimidated were now indirectly leading to the terrorization of a vulnerable citizen. Witness filled her with a sickening combination of fury and helplessness. The union's retaliation had escalated beyond personal attacks and political maneuvering into active criminal obstruction, targeting the very foundation of the judicial process she was sworn to uphold. The fight had become significantly dirtier and far more dangerous, not just for her, but for anyone perceived as standing against the union's agenda. The news that Mr. James Peterson, the elderly complainant in the original disciplinary hearing against officers Brennan and Ridgway, had been intimidated into withdrawing his testimony landed like a body blow, not just to the specific case, but to Judge Evelyn Hayes's faith in the possibility of achieving untainted justice. It was a sickening confirmation that Lieutenant O'Malley's network operated without scruple, employing criminal tactics to sabotage proceedings that threatened their interests. This presented Judge Hayes with yet another profound dilemma. Should she postpone hearing 87-2, indefinitely acknowledging the witness tampering had rendered a fair conclusion impossible, or should she proceed fulfilling her judicial duty to rule based on the evidence formally presented, however compromised that evidence now was? Postponing felt like rewarding the intimidation, allowing O'Malley to win through thuggery, dismissing the most serious charges outright. Felt like preemptively absolving the officers without fully considering the remaining evidence. Consulting again with Chief Judge Roberts and Ethics Counsel, the consensus, though difficult, was clear. Her duty was to rule on the record as it stood. She couldn't base a legal judgment on evidence that was no longer being offered, regardless of the reason for its absence. With grim determination, she reconvened the disciplinary hearing. The city attorney representing the internal complaint acknowledged, with visible frustration, that Mr. Peterson was unavailable to testify, leaving a significant gap in their case. Regarding the excessive force allegation, Arthur Thorne, representing Brennan and Ridgway, barely suppressed a smirk, sensing victory on the most serious point. Ben Carter wasn't involved in presenting this case, but the tension was felt throughout the courthouse. Judge Hayes presided over the final arguments, her face an unreadable mask. She listened intently as the city attorney focused on the remaining evidence, the partial bystander video, the inconsistencies in the officers' reports, the documented procedural violations. She then listened as Thorne predictably argued that without Peterson's testimony, the core allegation collapsed, entirely dismissing the video as inconclusive and the report inconsistencies as minor administrative errors. Throughout these final stages, Thorne continued his subtle provocations, occasionally referencing the need for judicial objectivity. Even in emotionally charged situations, a clear dig at Hayes's own recent assault. Hayes, however, remained impervious, ruling strictly on the relevance and admissibility of the evidence pertaining only to the Peterson incident. She sustained Thorne's objection. When the city attorney tried to speculate about why Peterson was absent, she overruled Thorne when he tried to dismiss the relevance of the procedural violations documented in the officers' reports. Judge Hayes, ruling fairly, even when it helps the guys who attacked her. That's incredible judicial integrity, isn't it? Comment number 1: if you respect her commitment to the law above personal feelings. After closing arguments, she took the matter under advisement, retreating to her chambers to deliberate and write her ruling. It was an agonizing process. She reviewed the existing evidence meticulously, the grainy video showing Brennan's aggressive movements, Ridgway's passive stance, the official reports containing demonstrable inconsistencies regarding timings and actions. She weighed this against the high burden of proof required to sustain findings of intentional excessive force or racial animus. Without Peterson's direct testimony describing the blows, the slurs, the lack of provocation, that specific element, while strongly suspected, could not be legally proven, based solely on the remaining flawed evidence. Her final written ruling was a model of precise legal reasoning constrained by the compromised record. She found, based on the video evidence and report inconsistencies, that Officer Brennan had violated departmental policy regarding de-escalation techniques and accurate reporting in the Peterson incident. She found Officer Ridgway had failed in his duty to intervene. She recommended significant disciplinary action, suspension without pay for several weeks for both officers, mandatory retraining in use of force, de-escalation, and implicit bias. But crucially, she concluded that due to the withdrawal of the complaining witness, the specific allegation of intentional excessive force amounting to assault in the Peterson matter could not be sustained under the clear and convincing evidence standard required in the disciplinary hearing. That ruling, finding some fault, but not the main charge because the witness was intimidated, is frustrating but legally sound, right? If you think witness intimidation succeeding, like this, is a tragedy, hit that like button. The reaction to her ruling was immediate and universally negative. Lieutenant O'Malley and the police union publicly blasted the decision. They claimed any finding of fault was proof of Hayes's vindictive bias. They ignored the acquittals on the most serious charge, focusing only on the recommended discipline vowing to fight it through arbitration and appeals. They intensified their calls for her removal from the bench. On the other side, community activists, victim advocacy groups, and many who had supported Hayes felt betrayed. They saw the ruling as a whitewash, a failure to hold the officers fully accountable for the original incident. They accused Hayes of lacking courage, of caving to pressure, unable to understand, or unwilling to accept the legal constraints imposed by the witness intimidation. Even many of her judicial colleagues privately expressed relief that the contentious hearing was over, but kept their distance, viewing her now as a lightning rod for controversy. Judge Hayes found herself utterly isolated, attacked by the officers' supporters for finding any fault, and condemned by reform advocates for not finding enough. She had adhered strictly to the law, upholding her oath to judge impartially, based only on the evidence before her, even when it led to an unsatisfying conclusion. But in doing so, she had alienated nearly everyone. She had done her duty, but the cost was profound isolation and the bitter knowledge that the system itself had allowed intimidation to thwart true accountability. Judge Hayes ended up angering everyone by trying to rule fairly on incomplete evidence. That's a tough, lonely spot. If you appreciate stories that show the complexities and costs of seeking justice, subscribe for more narratives like this. Having delivered this controversial ruling in the original disciplinary case under immense duress, Judge Hayes now faced the separate stalled investigation into her own assault. Would the system that failed to protect her witness, Mr. Peterson, now similarly fail to deliver meaningful justice for the attack against her? And with potential allies dwindling and the union more hostile than ever, how could she possibly fight back when the official channels seemed determined to minimize or excuse what happened? That morning outside the courthouse doors, Judge Evelyn Hayes's nuanced ruling in the original disciplinary hearing, Case 87-2, succeeded only in deepening her isolation, while she had meticulously adhered to legal standards, ruling solely on the compromised evidence presented. The outcome satisfied no one. Sergeant O'Malley and the police union decried the finding of any fault, painting it as proof of her bias, while reform advocates felt she had failed to deliver meaningful accountability. Now, with the disciplinary hearing, concluded albeit unsatisfactorily, public and institutional attention shifted squarely onto the parallel investigation into the assault against Judge Hayes herself, led by Special Counsel Miriam Shah. Could the system deliver justice when the victim was one of its own judges? Would Brennan and Ridgway face real consequences for their violent, prejudiced actions? That morning outside the courthouse, Special Counsel Shah, known for her thoroughness, faced immediate and significant headwinds. Arthur Thorne, acting for Brennan and Ridgway, immediately filed motions challenging Shah's jurisdiction, questioning the impartiality of her appointment and seeking to limit the scope of her investigation. Thorne advised his clients to refuse any further interviews invoking their Fifth Amendment rights beyond their initial carefully crafted statements. He aggressively contested every request for documents, demanding investigators secure warrants for information already seemingly covered by departmental cooperation protocols, exploiting every possible procedural delay. The police union, meanwhile, continued its public relations war, portraying Shah's investigation as an extension of Judge Hayes's supposed vendetta. They highlighted the ambiguous elements of the security footage, emphasizing the lack of clear audio, and arguing the video actually supported the officer's claims of a confusing situation requiring standard restraint. They subtly intimidated potential witnesses. Maria Flores remained steadfast in her account, but other courthouse employees who might have seen or heard something became conveniently forgetful, their memories clouded by an understandable fear of crossing the powerful police union or its aggressive president. Political pressure also began to weigh on Shah's investigation. State legislators, allied with the union, questioned the investigation's mounting costs in budget hearings. The governor, facing pressure from law enforcement lobbying groups, made public statements emphasizing the importance of supporting officers and cautioning against rushing to judgment. Shah found herself increasingly squeezed, possessing compelling testimony from Judge Hayes and Maria Flores, and damning, if imperfect, video evidence, but facing unified denials from the officers. relentless legal obstruction from thorn political headwinds, and a lack of corroborating witnesses willing to brave the potential consequences. The investigation seemed to be losing momentum. Stalling against the institutional inertia and deliberate resistance, Shah requested a private meeting with Judge Hayes and Chief Judge Roberts. Held in the secure confidentiality of Roberts's chambers, the meeting was somber. Shah laid out the situation. Bluntly, Judge Hayes, she began your testimony, and that of Ms. Flores is credible and compelling. The video footage visually corroborates the physical altercation and contradicts the officer's initial claims of minimal necessary force. However, she continued, her voice heavy with frustration. The defense strategy is clear. Thorne will exploit the video's limitations, particularly the lack of audio. He will argue mistaken identity, escalated by perceived non-compliance. He will claim the force used falls within acceptable departmental training parameters. Even if initiated under faulty premises, he will present Miller and Ridgway's identical rehearsed denials. We lack definitive forensic evidence beyond your injuries, and we have been unable to secure additional eyewitnesses willing to testify against the officers given the current climate. She paused, letting the difficult reality sink in. The burden of proof for felony assault conviction, beyond a reasonable doubt, is extremely high. Given the ambiguities Thorne will exploit, and the inherent difficulty in convincing a jury to convict two police officers based primarily on testimony, even that of a judge, versus the officer's denials, I believe securing felony convictions against both officers would be an uphill battle with a significant risk of acquittal. An acquittal under these circumstances would be devastating, potentially seen as validating the officer's actions and permanently damaging public. Shah looked directly at Hayes, her expression pained. Therefore, reluctantly, my recommendation is to pursue alternative charges. We could likely secure convictions or a plea agreement on misdemeanor assault, reckless endangerment, or perhaps official oppression charges. These would still result in termination, loss of certification, and a criminal record, ensuring they never serve as officers again. Alternatively, we could refer the findings back to the police chief demanding termination. Based on departmental violations, substantiated by the video evidence avoiding a risky criminal trial altogether. The words hung in the air, heavy with compromise. Judge Hayes listened impassively, her face revealing nothing but inside a cold, desolate feeling spread. The system she had dedicated her life to serving, the system that demanded rigorous proof and impartial justice, seemed incapable or unwilling to fully address a blatant, violent assault committed against one of its own judges by its own sworn officers. The recommendation for lesser charges or mere disciplinary action felt like a profound betrayal, a signal that even for a judge, justice could be diluted, negotiated away when confronting the entrenched power, protecting rogue officers. The path to accountability once again seemed obstructed, not by a lack of truth but by the system's inherent limitations, and perhaps its lack of will. The prospect of Brennan and Ridgway escaping felony charges for their actions that morning felt like a denial of justice, not just for her but for every citizen subjected to similar abuse, without her platform or visibility. The investigation wasn't over, but its potential conclusion felt deeply, profoundly unsatisfying. Judge Evelyn Hayes left the meeting with Special Counsel Miriam Shah, feeling a profound sense of disillusionment, colder and heavier than the January air outside. The recommendation for misdemeanor charges or mere departmental discipline for officers, Brennan and Ridgway, felt like a betrayal, not just of her personally, but of the very notion of judicial inviolability. It was a tacit admission that the system lacked the will or the capacity to fully hold its own agents accountable for a violent, prejudiced assault, even when the victim wore the robe. Shah's reasoning about the high burden of proof and the ambiguities of the evidence was legally sound, perhaps, but it felt like an abdication of responsibility, a surrender to the political and institutional pressures exerted by Sergeant O'Malley and the police union. Hayes retreated to her chambers, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. To accept Shah's recommendation meant allowing Brennan and Ridgway to escape meaningful criminal consequences for their actions. It meant validating the narrative that what happened was merely a regrettable mistake easily handled internally. It meant signaling that assaulting a judge, if you could muddy the waters, enough carried little. Real risk. But what was the alternative? As a judge, she was bound by ethical constraints stricter than almost any other public official. She could not publicly denounce Shah's decision. She could not leak confidential investigative material. She could not pick up the phone and lobby politicians or prosecutors. That path led to censure, perhaps even impeachment, destroying her career and ironically undermining the very judicial integrity she sought to protect. For days, she wrestled with this dilemma, pacing her chambers, reviewing legal ethics opinions, consulting hypothetically with trusted mentors outside her jurisdiction. The thought of Brennan and Ridgway facing only minor repercussions while she carried the physical and emotional scars of their assault and the public attacks fueled by their lies gnawed at her. But the risks of overstepping her judicial bounds were immense. Then slowly, a different path began to emerge. One fraught with peril, but perhaps the only way to force the hand of a reluctant system. She wouldn't leak confidential information. She wouldn't directly interfere, but she possessed knowledge, context, publicly verifiable facts that, when assembled and presented correctly, would paint an undeniable picture of injustice and systemic failure. The public knew about the incident, but they didn't grasp the full staggering context, the fact that Brennan and Ridgway were the subjects of the hearing she was presiding over that same day. They didn't know the details of the union's immediate preemptive recusal motion based on fabrications. They didn't know the full extent of the stonewalling or the specific limitations of the evidence that were now being used to justify lesser charges. If that context became public knowledge presented by a credible independent source, the resulting outrage might create pressure that even the most entrenched political interests could not ignore. It was a gamble, a dangerous one requiring absolute discretion and plausible deniability. She made a decision. She reached out through a completely secure and anonymized channel, initiating contact with the former law clerk, Michael Chennault, now a respected constitutional law professor, known for his integrity and connections to serious investigative journalists. She arranged a brief, untraceable meeting far from the courthouse. She provided Chennault with no documents, no confidential files, only a verbal, carefully curated narrative focusing on the publicly verifiable timeline, the sequence of events, the identity of the officers, the context of the hearing, the nature of the recusal motion, the known limitations of the security footage, and the apparent outcome of Shah's investigation, suggesting avenues for independent verification through public records and known media reports. Chennault, understanding the gravity and the implicit request, relayed the core elements as an anonymous tip from a concerned high-level legal source to Lena Petrova, an award-winning investigative journalist at a major national newspaper, known for her tenacity in tackling powerful institutions. Petrova, initially skeptical, began digging. She filed public records requests, interviewed courthouse sources off the record, reviewed already public statements from O'Malley, and Thorne scrutinized the limited publicly available information about the disciplinary hearing and Shah's investigation. She obtained through legal channels stills from the security footage, previously released during discovery in a related civil motion. The pieces began to fit together, corroborating the anonymous tip's incredible context. Petrova's resulting exposé, published simultaneously online and in the newspaper's Sunday edition, was a bombshell. It laid bare the entire sequence, the shocking assault on Judge Hayes, the unbelievable coincidence or perhaps motive of the officers' identities, their connection to the hearing, the union's immediate attempt to blame the victim and force recusal, the stalled investigation and the likely outcome of minimal charges. Petrova didn't need confidential leaks. She simply assembled the publicly available puzzle pieces, guided by the crucial context provided, highlighting the pattern of institutional failure and the appearance of a cover-up. The story exploded across the internet and news networks. The reaction was immediate, overwhelming, and furious. Public outrage dwarfed previous responses. Citizens flooded social media demanding answers. Hashtags like Justice for Judge Hayes and Corrupt Cops trended nationally. Civil rights groups, legal associations, editorial boards across the country condemned the assault and the apparent failure of the investigation. The pressure on Special Counsel Shah, the State Attorney General, the police chief and elected officials became unbearable. Phone lines jammed, protests erupted outside the courthouse and state capitol, demanding real accountability. Judge Hayes watched the firestorm unfold from her chambers. She had not violated her oath. She had not leaked confidential material. She had simply ensured the truth presented in its full, stark context reached the public square. The gamble had paid off, unleashing a wave of public scrutiny that the system could no longer ignore or manage through quiet compromise. The carefully controlled narrative O'Malley and Shah had tried to maintain was obliterated, replaced by raw public anger and demands for genuine justice. Lena Petrova's meticulously researched exposé detonated in the public sphere with the force of a meticulously placed charge. The story wasn't just about an assault anymore. It was about the shocking context, the blatant conflict of interest, the systemic failure, and the appearance of a coordinated cover-up. The narrative immediately shifted. Public outrage, previously simmering, now boiled over. Citizens bombarded the offices of the mayor, the governor, the state attorney general, and special counsel Miriam Shah, demanding action, not just investigation but tangible consequences. National media outlets seized the story, amplifying the pressure. Civil rights organizations issued scathing condemnations, demanding federal intervention. The American Bar Association expressed grave concern over the assault on a sitting judge and the apparent obstruction of justice. Politicians who had previously offered lukewarm support for law enforcement or urged caution now scrambled for cover, issuing strongly worded statements condemning the officers' alleged actions and promising full support for Shah's investigation. The political calculus had irrevocably changed. The cost of defending Brennan Ridgway, and by extension, the police union, had suddenly become prohibitively high. Under this intense, unavoidable scrutiny, Special Counsel Shah publicly announced her office was reopening its evidentiary review in light of new information and public concern, while carefully avoiding direct criticism of her previous recommendation. She signaled a renewed commitment to pursuing all available leads. Her office confirmed informal consultations with the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, hinting strongly that a full federal investigation was likely imminent, adding another layer of pressure on everyone involved. Sergeant O'Malley initially attempted to maintain his defiant posture. He held another press conference flanked by Arthur Thorne, denouncing Petrova's article as irresponsible journalism, fueled by anonymous lies, and orchestrated by Judge Hayes herself. He attacked the media for bias, accused politicians of cowardice, and vowed the union would continue to defend its members against this politically motivated persecution. But his bluster rang hollow this time. The visual evidence from the security footage, however imperfect, combined with the undeniable context of the officers assaulting the judge presiding over their own hearing, created a narrative too powerful for even his practiced spin to overcome. Cracks began to appear within the union's usually solid front. Rumors circulated of closed-door meetings, where O'Malley faced criticism from some board members for his handling of the crisis officers. Brennan and Ridgway found themselves increasingly isolated, suspended from duty pending the outcome of Shah's reopened investigation. They became pariahs, symbols of the scandal engulfing the department. Their fellow officers, once quick with supportive nods, now avoided eye contact. The disciplinary findings issued by Judge Hayes in the original Peterson hearing, which O'Malley had previously mocked, now loomed large, reinforcing the narrative of officers with a history of misconduct. The pressure, particularly on the younger officer Kyle Brennan, became immense. He saw his career evaporating, his reputation destroyed, facing potential criminal charges, possibly federal ones, and the prospect of a lengthy prison sentence. He felt the union's support perhaps wavering. Thorne offered aggressive legal defense, but could he guarantee an acquittal, especially if federal prosecutors got involved? Brennan started to weigh his options, his loyalty to his partner Ridgway, and the union warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Investigators from Shah's team, sensing the shifting dynamics, applied targeted pressure. They subtly let it be known through back channels that cooperation could be beneficial, that federal involvement often meant harsher sentencing guidelines. They emphasized the strength of Judge Hayes's and Maria Flores's testimony, now amplified by public outrage and the problematic visual evidence they perhaps offered. Ridgway, a separate, less favorable deal, creating a classic prisoner's dilemma. Finally, Brennan cracked. He retained a private criminal defense attorney separate from the union-provided lawyer Arthur Thorne. Through his new counsel, he secretly reached out to special counsel Shah's office, indicating a willingness to cooperate in exchange for leniency. After tense negotiations, a proffer agreement was reached. Brennan sat down with Shah and her lead investigators, his demeanor starkly different from the arrogant swagger he displayed outside the courthouse. Trembling at times, he recounted the events of that morning, confessing that there was no legitimate reason to stop Judge Hayes, admitting his actions were fueled by racial assumptions, annoyance at her perceived challenge to his authority, and a desire to assert dominance. He acknowledged that Judge Hayes had remained calm, identified herself clearly, and did nothing to provoke the physical assault. He admitted that the force used was excessive, unnecessary. He then detailed the immediate aftermath, how St. O'Malley and Arthur Thorne had arrived at the precinct shortly after the incident, coached him and Ridgway extensively on the fabricated story of mistaken identity, Hayes's alleged aggression, and the need for restraint. He confirmed O'Malley had explicitly instructed them to stick to that false narrative, promising the union would protect them fully. Brennan's confession, corroborated by his willingness to testify against Ridgway and potentially O'Malley, was the decisive breakthrough. Shah now had direct insider testimony, confirming the assault, the cover-up, and the union leadership's role in orchestrating the false narrative. The ambiguity exploited by the defense was significantly diminished. The path towards criminal accountability for Brennan, Ridgway, and possibly others, had suddenly become much clearer thanks to the immense pressure generated by public outrage and the cracking of the blue wall of silence from within. Officer Kyle Brennan's decision to cooperate sent shockwaves through the defense camp and provided special counsel Miriam Shah with the leverage she needed to finally ensure meaningful accountability for the assault on Judge Evelyn Hayes armed. With Brennan's detailed confession and his agreement to testify against his partner, Ridgway Shah's team presented an ironclad case. Brennan pleaded guilty to felony assault charges, albeit potentially reduced in exchange for his testimony. Facing the certainty of conviction based on his partner's account, Officer Mark Ridgway was forced into accepting a plea deal as well, admitting guilt to serious charges, including assault and falsifying official statements. Both men lost their jobs, their pensions, their right to carry firearms, and faced significant prison sentences, finally answering for their violent actions that morning. Justice for the direct assault, albeit delayed and hard-fought, had been achieved. But Brennan's cooperation unlocked something far more significant than the resolution of Judge Hayes's personal case, driven by self-preservation and perhaps a desire to lessen his own sentence. Brennan provided investigators with a detailed account of the internal machinations orchestrated by Sergeant Dennis O'Malley and the police union, shedding light on why O'Malley had reacted with such extreme ferocity to Judge Hayes presiding over the original disciplinary hearing, Case 87-2. Brennan revealed that the Peterson incident, the subject of that original hearing, was not merely an isolated case of excessive force. It threatened to expose a long-running scheme, masterminded by O'Malley, involving a clique of officers loyal to him. Brennan testified that O'Malley encouraged certain officers, including himself and Ridgway, to engage in aggressive, proactive policing, often targeting minority neighborhoods, generating arrests based on flimsy pretexts. These arrests often resulted in seized assets, court appearances, and significant overtime pay for the officers involved. O'Malley allegedly ensured complaints arising from these encounters were systematically buried through his influence over internal affairs investigators and the union grievance process, creating a protected class of officers who operated with impunity. The Peterson case, Brennan explained, was dangerous because the partial bystander video, combined with Peterson's initial adamant claims, threatened to conclusively prove not just excessive force, but deliberate report falsification, a potential perjury charge that could unravel the entire scheme. If an impartial and thorough judge like Hayes presided, O'Malley feared she would dig too deep. Too many questions connect the dots and potentially expose the entire overtime padding and false arrest racket. Brennan also provided details about how O'Malley used union funds and resources to intimidate witnesses in sensitive cases, including corroborating the pressure campaign against Mr. Peterson and hinting at similar tactics used historically. He described a culture of fear and coerced loyalty enforced by O'Malley, who rewarded compliant officers and ruthlessly punished dissenters. Special Counsel Shah's team, working now in conjunction with federal investigators, used Brennan's testimony as a roadmap. They corroborated his claims through forensic accounting of union funds, analysis of overtime records, seizure of O'Malley's encrypted communications, and eventually securing corroborating testimony from other officers, emboldened by Brennan's cooperation or facing their own potential charges. The investigation culminated in a stunning federal indictment, unsealed weeks. After Brennan and Ridgway were sentenced, Sergeant Dennis O'Malley, the powerful, seemingly untouchable Union president, was arrested by FBI agents charged under the RICO Act with racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, witness tampering, bribery, and fraud. The indictment alleged he ran the police union not as a fraternal organization, but as a criminal enterprise dedicated to enriching himself and his cronies, protecting corrupt officers, and systematically undermining legitimate internal investigations and criminal prosecutions. The news of O'Malley's arrest sent tremors through the city's political and legal establishment. It suggested a level of systemic corruption far deeper than previously imagined, implicating potentially dozens of officers and perhaps even political figures who benefited from O'Malley's influence. Judge Evelyn Hayes received the news of O'Malley's indictment with a complex mix of emotions. There was a profound sense of vindication, knowing that the architect of so much of the obstruction and personal attacks against her was finally facing federal charges. There was relief that the deeper rottenness Brennan's cooperation revealed was being brought into the light, but there was no elation, no simple sense of victory. Her own assault, a traumatic event born from individual racist assumptions, had inadvertently become the catalyst, the stray spark that ignited the fuse leading to the exposure of O'Malley's long-running criminal conspiracy. The fight she had endured, the threats, the isolation, the political attacks, had ultimately served a purpose far larger than her own case. She had weathered the storm, held fast to her principles, and in doing so, played a role in revealing a cancer within the city's power structure. As she prepared to return fully to her judicial duties, presiding over new cases unrelated to her ordeal, she did so with a renewed but sobered sense of purpose. The convictions of Brennan and Ridgway and the indictment of O'Malley were significant victories for justice, but they were also stark reminders of the constant vigilance required to protect the integrity of the legal system. The shadows of corruption ran deep, and the fight for true, systemic reform for equal justice genuinely applied to all regardless of race or station remained an ongoing, arduous, and essential battle. The cold Philadelphia morning when she was slammed against a courthouse wall had changed her irrevocably, forging her resolve in the fires of injustice and leaving her more determined than ever to wield her gavel not just as a symbol of the law, but as a shield against the darkness that constantly sought to undermine it. Judge Evelyn Hayes's shocking ordeal underscores the dangerous intersection of implicit bias, abuse of authority, and institutional protectionism. The initial assault, born from officers mistaking a black female judge in a coat for a threat, vividly demonstrates how quickly racist and sexist assumptions can lead to violence, erasing status and identity in an instant. It's a chilling reminder that badges and uniforms do not grant immunity from prejudice, and that profiling can victimize anyone regardless of their position within the very system law enforcement serves. The story further reveals the fierce mechanisms often deployed to protect officers accused of misconduct. The immediate, aggressive counterattack by the police union, attempting to blame the victim, force recusal through fabricated claims, leak damaging information, and even intimidate witnesses, highlights the often insurmountable obstacles faced when seeking accountability. It exposes how loyalty within ranks, amplified by powerful union structures, can prioritize shielding officers over uncovering truth or upholding justice, creating a culture where misconduct can fester. Judge Hayes's journey through the ethical minefield of presiding over her attacker's original hearing, while simultaneously being investigated for the assault against her, illuminates the profound complexities faced by those seeking integrity within flawed systems. Her commitment to legal principle, even when it led to politically unpopular or personally unsatisfying outcomes, showcases the immense burden and isolation carried by those who prioritize impartiality above retribution or expediency. Ultimately, the narrative demonstrates how a single act of prejudiced violence can inadvertently unravel deeper, more systemic corruption. The desperate measures taken by the union president to control the situation stemmed not just from the assault on Hayes, but from the fear that the original misconduct hearing itself threatened to expose a larger criminal enterprise. This underscores the interconnectedness of abuses of power and the critical need for transparency and independent oversight. It teaches us that while individual acts of courage and resilience like Judge Hayes's are vital, true reform requires confronting the underlying systems that enable and protect misconduct at all levels. The twists and turns in Judge Hayes's story were truly unbelievable, weren't they? Can you even imagine the strength it took to preside over the hearing for the officers who had assaulted her just hours before? What did you think of her decision to refuse recusal? Was it judicial integrity or unnecessary risk? Comment number 1 below if you believe she made the right call. And the final revelation about Sergeant O'Malley's deeper conspiracy, were you shocked by how far the corruption extended? Share your biggest takeaways and reactions in the comments. We're eager to hear what resonated with you. If Judge Hayes's resilience and commitment to justice despite overwhelming odds moved you, please show your support by hitting the like button. To catch more intricate stories about power, prejudice, and the fight for accountability, make sure you subscribe and enable notifications. Sharing this story helps highlight these critical issues. Thank you for joining us on this intense and complex journey. Stay safe, stay informed, and always question the narrative.